Hello and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, and joining us in Melbourne, as you can hear tonight, People's Panellist Shee, a former IT executive who's concerned that Australian democracy is letting us down. The Shadow Minister for Environment and Water, Terri Butler. British philosopher A.C. Grayling, whose latest books trace the history of philosophy and the crises in modern democracy. Now, La Trobe University historian Clare Wright, who chronicled the campaign to win the vote for women. And the Minister for Population and Urban Infrastructure, Alan Tudge. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Q&A is coming to you live across Eastern Australia on ABC TV and across the nation on iView and News Radio. Well, there's a lot of great questions in the audience tonight. Let's go to our very first one. It comes from Brisbane via Skype, and it's from Drew Pavlu.
Hey, Tony. My name is Drew Butler. I'm a philosophy student at the University of Queensland. On the 24th of July, I helped to organise a pro-Hong Kong, pro-democracy rally on campus. And I was one of at least 5 students assaulted by a coordinated group of masked pro-Chinese Communist Party nationalist thugs. Later, I received dozens of death threats online. This was reported in the Australian and international press, but no Australian parliamentarian directly commented on it, and youth who went so far as to implicitly threaten my future student holding peaceful protests critical of the Chinese government. My question is this response a product of the fact that the Chinese Communist Party has systematically the loyalty of key government and non-government institutions in this country?
Okay, well, some of that broke up, obviously, and Shee, I'm going to start with you, but the point was there was a demonstration at UQ. They were pro-democracy demonstrators. There was a certain amount of violence and a lot of disputes with pro-Chinese Communist Party supporters. So first of all, what's your view of the nature of the protest movement in Australia and in Hong Kong?
Let's cover things in perspective. There's a lot of coverage about what's happening in Hong Kong, and I think one thing we need to look at really is to get a balanced view. News media everywhere always has a slight bias in its reporting. Even the ABC, the BBC and all that will be biased towards their ownership, the organization, the country and the values. So when we actually report it from our side, we tend to pick on the democratic side to show their views more often than the other side. And you can tell that from the reporting that we actually see. Now,
are you saying the reporting is somehow biased against China? Is that what you're saying?
Well, reporting from China will be biased towards China. Reporting from the West will be biased towards the West. And it's a given, really. And there's nothing much you can do about that. All right? But that's where we need to think out of the box, be very clear and objective in our views of what's happening. And what's happening in China, really. You need to look at a view of, say, the Chinese government. How are they looking at it versus how we look at it? Because we see it all the time. And we have this blinkered view. What we see on the news media can be selective. It can be very biased in some aspects. And I'll give you a very quick example. In Australia, when we catch people with bombs in the garages and homes, what do we call them? Terrorists. Correct. In Hong Kong, when you catch them with bombs and bomb-making material, what do we call them? Pro-democracy protesters. So there is a slant in reporting bias in that. But let's get back to the question in terms of what's happening in Hong Kong. I believe that what's happening in Hong Kong, in my view, stems from basically 2 areas. One, the frustration of the young Hong Kong people who appear to have been left behind as Hong Kong actually declines. Since post-1997, Hong Kong has actually lost quite a bit of its former stature and its status. When you look at the rise of mainland China, that's what's happened to Hong Kong. So the young, although they're educated, they may have a job, but their jobs don't pay them enough to have housing. If anyone wanted to buy a home in Hong Kong, have you seen the kind of money you got to pay even for a small little cubbyhole? It's amazing.
Shee, what I might do is get you to come back to some of those points in a minute. I just want to hear from the rest of the panellists what they think about the demonstration in Brisbane and the intimidation that went on to some degree on both sides. Terri, you come from Brisbane.
I'm a member of Parliament who represents an electorate in Brisbane, but I've always been a Queenslander, Tony, and it's interesting, I ran into the mother of a friend of mine at a Catholic church yesterday, and it reminded me of my friend's story. Her earliest memory was marching, well, she wasn't marching, she was in a pram against the Bjelke-Petersen government, and her parents chanting, "What do we want the right to march?" We have a recent history in Queensland of oppression against protesters, and many people, including many people in my party, fought for freedom of peaceful assembly. And protesters, whichever side they're on, in Queensland have a right to freedom of peaceful assembly. When violence is brought to bear against protesters or by protesters, that erodes and undermines the right to freedom of peaceful assembly. So people engaging in violence should think very carefully. It is, of course, a crime to assault someone. It's, of course, a crime to threaten to assault someone. But when it's done in a political context, that can actually have broader ramifications. People should think carefully. And I would say, in relation to the protests in Hong Kong, we should, as Australians, unashamedly stand up for Australian values. And those values include freedom of peaceful assembly. And I do hope...
Does it disturb you?
Well, I want to say this.
Oh, go ahead.
I do hope that restraint is exercised. There have been some very distressing scenes coming out of Hong Kong.
What about in Queensland, first of all? Does it disturb you that there are reports of pro-Hong Kong democracy demonstrators in Australia being intimidated? I
think all Queenslanders of goodwill would agree with me, that we should stand firm for people's right to protest and against violence, no matter who it's being brought by or against.
Anthony, what do you think? I mean, we're getting now a wave of protest movement supporting the pro-Hong Kong democracy movement, but we're also seeing the Chinese operating to some degree suppress those demonstrations in other countries.
Yeah, so I'm very sympathetic towards the Hong Kong demonstrators. I mean, I hope that they will behave with restraint, because the precedents are very, very bad about what mainland China's government might do when it loses patience. We've seen it in Tiananmen Square in 1989, and that was dreadful. So I do hope the demonstrators in Hong Kong will be sensible a bit, but I'm very, very sympathetic to their cause. I think they're courageous. I mean, after all, if we demonstrate in the streets of London or in Sydney, we don't face the kind of threat that they do in Hong Kong. Therefore, you have to take your hats off to them. One thing that's very worrying about what we've seen in the Brisbane case is that when very large numbers of Chinese students go abroad to study, in amongst them will be people who are there to watch them. These are people who are, in effect, this is not a conspiracy theory, it's pretty widely known, that there are people there who are planted among them to keep an eye on them and watch them. And these will be people who will be countering them in these demonstrations. And that's a kind of signal, it's a symptom of the fact that there is limited patience on the part of the Chinese authorities.
Yeah, Shee, just going back to you briefly, does it worry you that Chinese agents may be among the students, watching what the other students are doing, particularly when they're demonstrating?
Yes, I do. And also, Anthony's right. I mean, it's not new to anybody, really. I mean, even Americans watch their citizens abroad to see whether or not they're actually doing acts which are against the national interest. So it's not different. And I agree also with the sentiment that, hey, if you're going to demonstrate, you have a right to peaceful protest. But once it gets violent, that's really bad, because if you can't get the argument across in a civilized manner, you've lost the plot immediately. And when students resort to violence, especially when it goes to the point of destruction, throwing bricks at the police, at the authorities that you're supposed to respect and all that, that shows me that there is some organization that's involved in that, and we know there are hardcore students that are involved in all of those things. And these hardcore students are not really spontaneous. They're organized. You've seen the tactics they've deployed in the demonstrations. And it seems to me odd that people still think these students are just working by themselves. I would say, look, there's another player behind all of this.
Well, are you referring to intelligence agencies?
Yes, I believe
because obviously the Chinese would accuse the CIA of being involved in some of these events.
Oh, I think that is a natural response, because think about this. When our government databases get hacked, what do? Our knee-jerk reaction is pointing fingers at Russia and at China. when something happens to them, it's the same thing. They point it back to us, to the US, to the UK. And the thing is that, as I said, when you look at the sequence of events and the pattern of things happening, from the Chinese point of view, they would say, look, all these things are happening right now at a time of geopolitical tension. Who stands to gain the most? What's the motivation? If you did a crime investigation, that's one of the things you look for. What's the motivation? Who gets maximum advantage out of it? And they would actually look at the US.
Okay, AC Grayling just want to jump in there.
Just one very, very quick point, and that is that we've heard from people in Hong Kong who've been witnessing the demonstrations there that some of the Hong Kong police have been speaking to one another in Mandarin. Now, you can work out the consequences of that, or the implications of that anyway. The extra police drafted in are not Hong Kong police, they're mainland police. And this is a really, really bad sign. So, it's a dangerous, it's a volatile situation, and one can only hope the best.
I'm just going to quickly see if we can go back to our Skype questioner. Drew Pavlou, we missed some of your earlier question, but you were talking about there being violence within the demonstration that you were part of. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, Tony. Look, I'm just very disappointed in the comments made by our People's Panellists. I don't know who this nobody is, but the type of equivocating I'm hearing, claiming that there is violence on the part of Hong Kong students, claiming that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, and then thus implying that Hong Kong students are terrorists, I think it's absolutely sick. I'm not sure if he's actually talked to anyone from Hong Kong, seen what they're going through.
Drew, can I just interrupt you for a second? Where you are breaking up a little bit, so I don't know what's happening with your microphone, but to be clear, there have been reports that you also were sending some pretty inflammatory social media postings to the pro-Chinese students. So did the situation in the case of your demonstration become inflamed because both sides were behaving intolerantly?
Look, that's a really, really embarrassing question, I think, Tony. I went into the protest completely peacefully. Look, I may have responded to death threats by being a bit immature and responding with insults, but the fact that I went in as a peaceful protester and was assaulted by a coordinated group of masked thugs, and I'm being called a violent protester, and you're saying that there is violence on both sides, it reminds me a bit of Trump. There's fine people on both sides in the whole Charlottesville debacle. You know how it is.
Okay, well, you've made your point. Thank you, Drew. Alan Tudge, what do you think about protests happening on Australian soil, but turning violent and dangerous, partly because of Chinese influence?
Well, we don't know the latter. I mean, certainly I don't like to see any violent protests in Australia. We have a very strong and fine tradition of being able to protest peacefully. And people are able to say whatever they like at those rallies, as long as they're not inciting violence themselves as such in their language. But we condone violence of any type, and whether or not that's violence from Australians there or from international students participating, if they commit violent acts, then the police should take action and stop the violence.
What about the intelligence services, if indeed the suggestion that Chinese agents may be involved?
Well, I know that there are some suggestions of that, but I'm not aware of the evidence of that, and I'm very reticent to come to that conclusion based off media articles. But certainly we don't want to see any foreign interference in our democratic processes at all. And we've introduced already some foreign interference bills into the Parliament and had those passed. We're a robust democracy. People can protest freely and peacefully. People can say what they like peacefully and freely. But when it resorts to violence or when it resorts to any sort of foreign interference, that's when we say no.
Clare, Wright, what do you think?
Well, I'm surprised to find myself agreeing with both of the politicians on the panel. I think that peaceful protest is essential to our democracy, and the right to assembly is absolutely germane to who we are. And students have always protested on university campuses. Universities have always been places where ideas are tested and boundaries are pushed. And, I'm located on a university, I work in a university. What I see among many students is a kind of activism nostalgia. a sense that there is not enough robust discussion on universities anymore. You know, a sense that there was this kind of potentially mythical past where our parents were active in the Vietnam moratoriums or against the Springbok tours or anti-apartheid rallies. We actually don't see very much protest at all on our university campuses anymore. And I'm really pleased to see a student like Drew who is so articulate, so up to date with the issues. I'm really sorry that he's had the experience that he has. And again, I wouldn't condone violence on campuses or anywhere else either. But I think that universities are places, university campuses, and particularly young people and students are the ones who really are kind of the cutting edge of the activism. And as we know with Hong Kong, the extradition bill isn't really the source of the conflict, whether that goes through or not. I mean, studying the history of democratic protests in Australia and elsewhere really shows you that usually the extradition bill might be, you know, it's the tipping point, but it's not the cause. And it's like, you know, in the Boston Tea Party, tea wasn't the issue. In the Corn Laws, corn wasn't the issue. On the Eureka Stockade, the licence tax wasn't really the issue. It was about the power relations that underlay that particular set of grievances. And so it's actually about, in Hong Kong, what the government is going to do in order to listen to the people. And as I think Sue has said, what they really are struggling against. What is the real core of the disappointment, of the grievance, of the anger, of the sense of disempowerment? And it's not until governments grapple with that actually the issues can be resolved, and hopefully, as Anthony says, in a peaceful manner.
Okay, let's move on. We've got another question on the topic of China. It's from Jackie Patterson.
Last week, Andrew Hasty was widely chastised for his comments regarding China's rising power. It's quite apparent, though, that China is gaining power on an international scale in an unprecedented way. Due to our economic relationship with China, is Australia turning a blind eye to China's actions and increasing power, both here and abroad?
On Tudge.
I mean, the question didn't define precisely what she's concerned about in terms of China's actions. Andrew Hasty wrote that column, and essentially what he was saying is that we need to be very clear-eyed in relation to China and its ambitions and its strength. And in some respects, we are clear-eyed in relation to them. I mean, we have a good relationship with China. We have benefited immensely from their economic rise over time. Chinese people have benefited immensely, with hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty as a result of their economic growth, and obviously it's underpinned a lot of our wealth over the last couple of decades. But we also have good people-to-people linkages into China. We have a good strategic relationship too. But we are clear-eyed in the fact that they're not a democratic liberal society like we are. They are still an authoritarian regime, and that means that we have different values on some issues. And we need to understand that. We need to recognise that from time to time we will disagree with them. But we, as a government, tend to focus on the things that we do agree on, and supporting that economic relationship and the stronger people-to-people's linkages, while also recognising that we don't always agree on every single aspect.
Did Andrew Hasty make an error of judgment when he made the comparison between pre-war, that is pre-Second World War Europe, talking about the Maginot Line being an imaginary defence that the French had against the Nazi invasion, and suggesting that the Maginot Line is a way of thinking about what's happening with China now?
He was careful in some of his language there. I know many commentators have said that he'd made a direct comparison with Germany at the time, and I'm not sure if he did that.
What do you think he meant by the Maginot Line?
I think that his overall message in his article, from my reading of it and my speaking to him, is that we need to be very clear in terms of what their objectives are, what their ambitions are, what their strengths are, and to respond appropriately, understanding that. In some respects, understanding from their perspective, as Sue was saying previously as well, in terms of what their overall ambitions are as a nation, both this year and in the decades ahead. And they do have a very long-term view as to as to their future. That's what I think he was getting at. I mean, the main political analogy that he made in that piece was actually to the Soviet era, and saying that there's similarities there, and of course they're both driven by Marxist ideologies, although there's obviously differences there as well. But the main message from us as government representatives, and he's a backbencher entitled to put his view through, as a government minister, is that we have a strong relationship with China still, and it's China's growth has absolutely been in our interests, both economically, particularly economically, and we want to see the continued peaceful rise of China.
Okay, Terri Butler.
Well, obviously you're right to say that we have an important economic relationship with China. I mean, they're our largest trading partner, almost $200 billion worth of trade each year compared to the next largest, which is Japan at 77. So this is a material consideration, I think, for our nation in terms of our relationship with China. But that doesn't mean that we need to be in any way reluctant to speak up where we see problems in the way that China conducts its affairs in an appropriate way, obviously in an appropriate way.
Was Andrew Hasty appropriate in the way that he described? Because he got slapped down by several of his cabinet colleagues.
Before I talk about that, can I just say, I think we have a tradition in our country of being internationalist and outward looking and never being shy to speak out against human rights abuses. And that goes back to Doc Evatt. And I think that we have a tradition of standing up. And we would expect to do that in respect of any trading partner. And at the same time, I think Australians would expect our trading partners and allies to speak out if they think that Australia is doing something that is not right. And I think that that is a mature trading and diplomatic relationship, and that one of the problems I think that we all have in discussing Andrew Hasty's article or other commentary is that you entirely lose the nuance. We can't lose the nuance in discussing our relationship with big powers across the world or with smaller nations across the world. We've got to be able to find a way in the public square to have a conversation about these important issues that doesn't devolve into kind of sloganeering and point scoring. On Andrew's article, I haven't read Andrew's article, so I'm not going to try to talk about what I think he might have been saying or might not have been saying. I think, though, that it is incumbent on all of us in public life to be very careful about the analogies that we use and the metaphors that we use. But probably most importantly, the real question for me is, where's the Prime Minister on this? We've had a kind of cavalcade of Liberals out talking about, I mean, they even had Stuart Robert out talking about China, which I thought was a very big call from Minister Robert.
He has said the Prime Minister is a very complicated issue, and there's no doubt that it is.
He needs to be showing leadership. You don't outsource leadership on our relationship with our biggest trading partner to a backbencher. You just don't do that.
Terri.
Well, he needs to be stronger on it, Alan. The Prime Minister needs to be leading on this, not having a cavalcade of his ministers out there raising different positions, taking aim at each other. You've got Simon Birmingham criticising Andrew Hasty. You've got Peter Dutton out there defending Andrew Hasty. Why is the Prime Minister not stepping up and dealing with this? Because this is an important relationship and it needs to be treated carefully.
Very quick response to that, if you wish.
Oh, well, the Prime Minister did address his view on the very first day that it was published, the first press conference that the Prime Minister participated in. He was asked the question about Andrew Hasty's article, and he quite rightly pointed out that Andrew Hasty is in some respects entitled to his view as a backbencher, and it didn't necessarily reflect government policy. The Trade Minister has been out since, and the Trade Minister has made some particular comments, as has the Finance Minister, another very senior minister.
And the Home Affairs Minister.
All right, okay, well, we can go through the list of ministers forever. Anthony,
but everybody's gone through the same message in saying that the relationship with China is very important for Australia.
It's been really
Anthony, hang on, I'm going to interrupt so I can hear from the other panellists. Anthony.
Thank you, Tony.
Well, I've got to say, I've got a love-hate relationship with China. I lived there. I've written a couple of books about it with colleagues, including a book about the Chinese Communist Party. I've written about the philosophical tradition in China, which is incredibly rich and wonderful. But at the same time, you just have to look at some facts. China is very irredentist. every little bit of territory that it's ever had in its past it wants back. It's a military threat to Taiwan. Eventually there will be a serious problem there. It's building military bases in the South
By the way,
China
is it
Sea.
wrong to want Hong Kong back when it was actually stolen from them during the Opium Wars?
Well, I don't know. You guys can work this out when you try and get Darwin back from the Chinese in a few years' time. You know, but you know, you look at how they use economic colonization in Africa. There are tens of thousands of Chinese workers and experts and so on in parts of South Asia and in Africa. This expansion into the Spratlys and the building of military bases there is not a great sign. You know, China's self-perception of itself is of Zhongguo, which is the central kingdom, and they have a lot of historical resentment of what happened at the end of the Qing dynasty and the foreign colonization there. They are already a regional hegemon, and they want to be a world superpower. You might say, fair enough, that's okay, but look at their record. Look at Xinjiang. Look at Tibet. They're incredibly oppressive in those regions. Their human rights record is appalling. And you know, if you're in this very difficult position that your wonderful country is in, you have a great dependency on the economic relationship with them, but they are one of the worst human rights violators in the world today. And this is something which cannot just be, you know, passed over in saying, well, we have an important relationship with them. We have to stand up and say we don't like what they're doing. But frankly, that's not enough. It's not enough just to say it.
Shee.
I find myself agreeing with what the comments have been made regarding this particular question. Yes, Andrew Hasty is entitled to his opinion. Every one of us are. I think the important thing, as I said before, is to be able to discuss differences of opinion in a civilized manner without having to resort to violence and all that. Terri is right also because he is in government and he needs to basically coach his language, because at some point in time, if he becomes the future Prime Minister of Australia, what's going to happen when he actually meets up with his counterparts in China and them knowing what he's thinking about them? Now, given the military background that Andrew Hasty has and his close association with the US military and all that, I can understand his sentiment. His heart is in the right place. He's concerned about Australia and Australia only, which is good. And I would support that as well, wholeheartedly. Even if, for instance, he says things like, hey, you know, that we got to actually draw boundaries between this and that and make it very clear that to China that, look, this is not on, this is okay and all that, I would support that. So as I said, on this particular question, the relationship with China is a delicate one. It's hard to balance what we have with China with the US, because the two are fighting right over there. Do we just stand back? I would prefer that Australia treads its own path and be like little Switzerland in the Asia Pacific. And that might do us good. So we've got to think around those lines and maintain that balance. Perhaps be a broker for peace between the two superpowers. Why get pulled into it? Because we already know that we went into the wars in the past decades with the US based on a pack of lies. We went into Iraq on a pack of lies. What else are we going for? Vietnam was a pack of lies. So from a security point of view, you're going to the US and all that, you've got to be opening your mind up like a parachute. It works best when it's open, yeah? All right? And think about what it is, what kind of relationship are we having with the US? Are they taking us down the garden path again to another Vietnam, to another Iraq, another Afghanistan? So we have to be careful about that. China, of course, you still got to treat with caution as well. It's still a big mystery to a lot of people who cannot think of the mindset that China is going through. But if you look at the history of China, you can understand why it's doing what they're doing.
Shee, it's a very long history.
Yes.
And we might not have time for all of it tonight. We have to move on to other questions because we've got a whole bunch of questions about the nature of democracy. The first one comes from Saurabh Kamtika.
How has society found itself in a position where the lack of knowledge and experience in our leaders is seen as a virtue, where short-termism and sound bites have replaced careful, methodical and well-reasoned thinking, and where we have lost the ability to compromise? How do we extricate ourselves from this hole that we find ourselves in and restore what our ancestors fought so hard to preserve?
Clare, Wright, we'll start with you.
Well, that's a really interesting question of what our ancestors fought to preserve, what rights they actually were preserving, which ancestors were actually talking about there. And Australia did lead the world in democratic practice in the first decade of the 20th century. We are the world leader in suffrage. We were the first nation in the world to give women the right to vote and the right to stand for Parliament. New Zealand gave women the right to vote, but not the right to stand for Parliament until 1919. Our nation was founded on essentially a progressive basis. We were the first country in the world where we had an elected socialist government. We pioneered all sorts of rights and freedoms that we now consider today to be inherent to what it means to be an Australian. And yet, the people who we consider to be the precursors of our legacy are the Anzac soldiers. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't hold that legacy dear, but I think it's really important to remember that when we did step onto the international stage, when we did start to consider ourselves as a nation that was worth taking heed of, we were a nation of leaders, and we have forgotten that. And Terri, you say, you know, we have a tradition of being outward looking. Well, at the same time, we actually closed down so many of our doors. That Franchise Act that gave women the right to vote also disenfranchised Indigenous people, and it was also the second Act of Parliament, the first being the Immigration Restriction Act. So we have to think really carefully about what our democratic heritage and legacy is.
So can I put this to you, because just to go back to the question, was methodical and well-reasoned thinking ever really a critical part of the democracy here?
I think that it absolutely was.
And have we lost it? Because that's what the questioner says.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you for drawing me back to the question, Tony. Good job. I think
I forgot a question.
I think that there was a time where debate was conducted in a more civilised manner. I mean, we've just seen tonight, with respect, what happens when two politicians on a tiny little matter can just blow things up.
Well, they were pretty respectful, I think.
Oh no, I think you were
I've seen a lot worse on this panel.
I think you were respectful of each other,
And
but
it's a
it turned
pretty big issue too.
but it turned
Tiny's a
partisan pretty
not
quickly.
right description.
It turned partisan pretty quickly, and I think that's what puts a lot of voters off. I think it puts it's what breaks faith with people and democracy, because they want their leaders to be leading, to be seen to be leading, to not be squabbling, to not using our parliament as a place of incivility. And so we're worried about the social media sphere, the Twitter sphere, Facebook being a place of incivility. But I think we have to start in our parliament. And I think that there is leadership to be shown, and there's a heritage and a legacy to draw on in Australian history to say that we can be independent thinkers, and we can think things through, and we can lead by policy, and we can lead by legislation.
Okay.
And I suppose that's where I was coming from in that first example.
Fair enough. Anthony Grayling, this is a global issue, the loss of faith in democracy. Why is it happening?
Oh, well, I mean, have we got breakfast organised? We could discuss it properly. But just to focus down on one little thing. And everybody in this audience last night in bed was reading the Federalist Papers by Madison and Hamilton. So they will remember Federalist Paper number 10, in which Madison says the greatest danger to our political process is factionalism, is partisanship. And Clare has put a finger on something, or in the immortal words of a former pupil of mine at Oxford, she's put a foot on something important here, which is the fact that party political imperatives too often distort the debate that a society needs to be having with itself about what matters and where it's going to go. And one of the things that's happened as franchises have extended, as party discipline and whipping systems have become more important in political life, so that the sense that politics is a service rather than a career has been lost sight of. It's become more of a career. Now, with present company completely accepted, these are perfect examples of politicians who have great ideals and the interests of the public at heart. But there are others among their colleagues who think that the choice between towing the party line and judging, using their conscience and judgment to decide what to do, that has become blurred, if not indeed lost.
I can remember, Anthony, watching Yes Minister maybe 35, 40 years ago, where precisely the same problems appeared to be at the centre of politics. Really, has it changed that much?
Well, you and I are thinking in two different timescales here. I'm thinking of the last century or so. You're thinking about now.
Yeah, I was, I guess, because of what our questioner said. They're posing the question about now as if something's different.
Well, there is something different, actually, which is interesting. I mean, I do think the change in the ethos of political culture has been gradual. It's been happening for a long enough time, as you say. But some things are different now. For example, social media. For example, the completely unregulated agora, which it should be, I think, of cyberspace, criticism, trolling, arguments, good ideas being put forward, people saying terrible things. The great lavatory wall of the internet, where there's more bad than good, but some good. And I think that's changed the nature of debate too, because it's sharpened things. It's given an edge to things, which is sometimes uncomfortable and unproductive. Whether our political orders in Australia, in the UK, in the United States of America are responding in the right way, well, you only have to look at today's UK or today's US to think absolutely not.
Shee, we advertised you at the beginning as being someone who thinks there's a problem with democracy as we think about it here in Australia. What is wrong in your view?
First of all, there's no pure democracy in any country, including Australia. I don't see it that way. And democracy itself really is a concept, and it's really a means to an end. And we are thinking of it as the end game, which it's not. When you say, look, I fight for democracy, you're fighting for democracy for what? At the end of the day, what is it that you want? You want a good life? You want safety and security? You want freedom? You want prosperity? That's what you're fighting for. So democracy is a means to get there. But the institutions we put in place to implement that democracy are flawed because it's man-made. And it's flawed from the way it's started. For people who got involved in it and set up the institutions had vested interest in making sure that they benefited the most from there. Look at the way we do elections. If democracy was perfect, Trump wouldn't be in power. It's very simple.
But you have to draw a distinction between the American democracy and ours. We have compulsory voting.
I understand. And the thing is, even with compulsory voting, you still have people like the former Senator Fraser Anning,
yes, but
who got in.
Senators are not majoritarian electorates.
I understand.
In the House they are.
Yes.
I'm just going to interrupt you both to go to our next question because in a way you've almost anticipated it. It comes from Samuel Chesachetti.
Yeah, my question is in relation, that's what has been mentioned by the panelists, mentioning especially the United States of America, the election of Donald Trump. Now, of course, there's no pure democracy. My question is, Donald Trump's election was such that he won more states than his opponent, and he succeeded to get more electoral college by just a simple democratic system of the United States as it has existed till now, by convincing the voters that he was the best candidate. So why would that be considered a crisis of democracy instead of actually looking at it as democracy in practice because people voted for him? Or is it because there is a group of elite that disagree with the vote of the regular people? Therefore, democracy is in crisis.
Terri, I know one wants to speak at once. I'm going to start with Terri Butler and Terri.
Well,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, my point...
Trump is proof that democracy works. I think that's the core.
I heard the question, but the point I was making about compulsory voting and about majoritarian compulsory voting is simply this. In the US, where you don't have compulsory voting, half the people vote and half of them vote for the successful candidate. So the president's elected on a slightly larger plurality, I can never say plurality, minority than the losing candidate. In Australia, because we have compulsory voting and because we have compulsory voting in a lower house where to win a seat you have to win a majority of the preferences of the population voting for you, and then you form the government from the lower house, our system is more democratic in my opinion, which is not to mean any disrespect, of course, to the United States or to nations where they have first past the post instead of the much more civilised process of compulsory preferential voting. But we have our democracy has survived, I think, a little better. Yes, we have some extreme voices in the Senate, which is the house in which people are elected on minorities of the vote rather than majorities of the vote. But ultimately, if you look at our lower house where governments are formed, it is, I think, a much more moderate form of representative democracy. It's a form of representative democracy where the people who have a vote in the House have been able to attract not just the largest minority of votes in their electorate, but they're the person who has actually been able to attract the majority.
Okay.
After
I'm going to just
50%.
pass on to Anthony, who wants to jump in, and then to this side of the panel. Please address the issue about Trump rather than why we've got a better voting system in Australia.
No, quite right. I mean, Hillary Clinton got more than 3 million votes more than Trump got. He got the votes in the right place in order to get the Electoral College. The Electoral College was set up to ensure that no idiot, tweeter, sexual harasser, ignoramus would get into the White House. You see, it works perfectly in the United States. So in two different ways, you've got a perfect example of how the democracy isn't working. Because if it were, you just wouldn't have somebody like Trump being there. You wouldn't even get some of the other people who stood for the party candidatures putting themselves forward and getting as far as they did in the process.
Samuel, you want to jump in, and I'm going to go to the other side of the panel once you do.
I probably would think that the very comment that Anthony makes a totally opposite, if it makes my point, and here's what I'll say, and I'll ask you and see what you see through it. I think that the problem is not addressing Trump. It is basically now addressing the founding fathers of the United States. They set their electoral college to make sure that there were smaller states and bigger states. If you had to go by the majority of vote, the candidate would have just simply to do their campaign in New York and in somewhere in, let's say, in Florida, and that's it. So smaller states like Utah and so on and so forth will not even have a voice. The American founding fathers made it so that every candidate would have to go across all the states, and so Trump knew that. He played by the rules, and you might disagree with his ways, but he achieved it democratically. 30 states that he won. Why would we, therefore, it seems like the dislike of Trump is now starting to get us to question the very democratic system that has worked for so long. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, just before I throw it back to Anthony, I want to hear from the other side of the panel. So, Alan Tudge, you first.
I completely agree with Samuel. I think he's spot on there. I mean, Donald Trump got elected to be president under the system which elected previously Obama and Ronald Reagan and Clinton and everybody else. The system was exactly the same. He got elected fairly and squarely under that system. Now, you might not like him, Anthony, and many people maybe in this audience may not like him, but that's the system, and he got elected under it. I mean, we've had elections in the past here where the government of the day didn't get the majority vote across the nation, but nevertheless still became the government of the day because we won the most seats in the lower house. And that's our system. It's our democratic system, which works pretty well. Now, Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government apart from any other one that's been tried from time to time. And maybe he's right. Democracy, it's sometimes uneasy as we work through it. It's sometimes messy. But geez, I am so glad that Australia is a democracy. America is one of the great democracies in the world as well, and we've constantly got to defend our democracy because it fundamentally underpins the freedoms that we enjoy in this country.
Okay, Clare.
Well, without wanting to fly the flag for America or imply that Trump is anything other than a nitwit, I just agree that the system did work. And there's 2 points. One, not all democracies are created equal. You're right, Terri. We have a very strong and robust democracy in Australia because we have certain institutions of our democracy that other countries don't have.
Yes.
We have compulsory voting.
We have majority voices. We also have ways to avoid minority
registration,
oppression.
which is another thing. And at the last election, we can say democracy is in crisis, but at the last election, we had the highest voter registration that we've ever had.
That's right.
We have an independent electoral commission, which other countries don't have, and we have our voting on Saturday. And now that's a huge difference as well. I think Britain has the voting on Thursdays, and America on Tuesdays,
And
and that makes a difference.
Can I
That makes
just
a
actually,
difference.
Anthony, it's from either side of you, you're hearing the argument that if only you had the Australian system,
Because
things would be much
Australians are
better.
great.
In America and Britain, you probably wouldn't have had Brexit.
Well, we only usually can I just say we only usually pat ourselves on the back for our sporting
There's the crisis in
victories.
democracy, though. I mean,
I
Brexit's a great
just threw to
example of
Anthony, we're going to
crisis in
hear what he
democracy.
says. Go ahead.
Well, as a matter of fact, you have some things in the Australian system here which are very desirable, and I would like to see them generalised, in fact, to other democracies. But this discussion is missing a point. The point is not that Trump was elected fairly and squarely on the basis of the American system. The point is that what's wrong with the American system that has given rise to Trump? That's the real point here. And I don't think that democracy is working well in the United States if the product is Trump. I think that there's a perfectly clear argument given about that. How can it be? You know, leave aside the point that a distinction needs to be drawn between, on the one hand, having a Senate which is a state's house, so the representation in the government of the United States of America does cover the whole of the United States of America, because every state, no matter what the population is, will send 2 senators to the Senate. The Electoral College has got nothing to do with that. The Electoral College does not serve the interests of the states. The Electoral College was a body that was put forward by Hamilton to be a kind of final stopgap and assessment about whether or not the person who was going to occupy this very, very high office of state would be fit for the purpose. And that's it. That's a different matter. Now, in a situation like the one that we've had in the United States, if a candidate has over 3 million votes more than another candidate, and by the way, whatever else you think about Hillary Clinton, she's probably the most experienced and qualified person ever to run for the White House, and Trump the exact opposite. You have to ask yourself the question, is this really working? Is the system producing people whom you might, whatever else you think about them, nevertheless be fit for the office that they occupy?
But didn't Hillary Clinton make a fatal flaw in calling Trump supporters a basket of deplorables for exactly that reason, that it appears that the electors, the very people who want Trump there, who got him there, are the sort of people who you're suggesting shouldn't, under the current situation, either their power, they shouldn't have that power in their vote, or they got it wrong.
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm not saying they shouldn't have a vote. Of course they should have a vote. Did she make a mistake in saying that about them? Of course she did. That was a very clay-footed thing to do. That's not the point that I'm making. The point I'm making is that if a democratic system was such that the two sides of it, both the institutions of the democracy, the electoral system and the way that the powers and the limits of powers of people who occupy those offices are clear and transparent and very well thought through. And on the other hand, that people are well informed, that they have access to good information, that they're not manipulated without knowing that they're being manipulated, and where their votes count. I mean, the United States of America has one representative house, the House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress. It's elected on a first-past post system, which is terribly undemocratic. And because of the state's control of congressional districts and a huge amount of gerrymandering that goes on, seats in the House of Representatives in the United States of America, 90% of them or nearly, never change hands because of the control that the parties have over them.
All right.
So this is not, the United States of America is not a democracy.
Okay.
It's a sort of partial democracy.
How
and
can you say that, Anthony? The United States is not a democracy. It's one of the great democracies of the world. But just because you don't like the outcome of the last election, you can't say it's not a democracy.
But I think the outcome of the last election is a symptom of the problem.
Okay.
It's no point.
All right. Just please, everyone stop, because you're actually not politicians, remember. Now, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter, and keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question is someone who doesn't think the Australian democracy is working so well. It's from Mona Vale via Skype. It's from Rebecca Clark.
Good evening, panel, and thank you. Can a country which has no Bill of Rights or anti-corruption commission, where the federal police raid media offices and a journalist's home, and the government prosecutes whistleblowers, where public servants cannot even anonymously criticise government policy, where freedom of information requests are expensive, often delayed, denied or redacted, and with minimal parliamentary sitting days, be considered a modern liberal democracy? Or would it be better described as an authoritarian state where the government is against transparency, accountability and individual rights. If this is so, how concerned should we be, and should we be protesting en masse before we have nothing left to lose?
Alan Tudge.
I mean, to be honest, and with due respect to the questioner, I thought, it's a ridiculous question to suggest that Australia is an authoritarian state is just frankly wrong. And I would encourage her to speak to some people who have come from authoritarian states and escaped those places and come to Australia and been able to have all the freedom and prosperity that you get in Australia, the freedom to vote, the freedom to speak your minds, to pray as you wish, to peacefully assemble. We've got to put things in perspective here, honestly, because Australia is still a magnificent democracy, and there is a damn good reason why millions of people want to come to our shores every single year. And it's because we are free, because we accept people from around the world, because we're wealthy, and that is all underpinned by a liberal democracy.
Terri Butler.
But I'm sorry to ask Alan a question, but...
No, you can't ask him a question. You can say your comment.
I will say my comment, and my comment is this. I understand why you would respond to that part of the question and not the substantive parts about incursions on liberties.
There was about 5 or 6 points that she made beforehand, and we could debate every single one of those. They were all made in terms of assertions, so I didn't want to go through every single one.
But you must
The key
accept...
point that she was making was that we're all of a sudden becoming an authoritarian state, which we are not. I mean, the fact that we can have...
Let's let Terri Butler answer the
ABCTV
question as to whether... Do you think the questioner has a point?
One must... I don't think that you could properly describe Australia as an authoritarian state, but you must accept that hand in hand with concerns about democratic legitimacy are concerns about incursions of civil liberties. And you must accept that based on the reaction from, I think, across the Australian community to the police raids on Annika Smethurst's house. And I think you probably have to accept that from the comments that were made about the difficulties in obtaining access to documents through freedom of information. And I think that the questioner kind of let you off the hook a little bit by giving you something to respond to that was a little bit of hyperbole, but the underpinning issues, I think, do need a response from your government.
Alan, can I ask you whether you've... Can I ask a question?
Actually, I prefer if you just make comments and let him respond to them.
Can I suggest...
that I respond to your comment?
That you read Gillian Triggs's book, Speaking Up.
Yeah.
If you haven't already, the former...
I know Gillian.
You know Gillian. And because Gillian outlines in stark and evidence-based terms the number of our civil liberties that have been eroded over the last 10 years, particularly in relation to the anti-terrorism laws. I agree, we are not living in an authoritarian state, but it is a frightening list of the contraction of our rights and liberties that we have fought hard for in the past.
I mean, this is you've raised a really complex matter in terms of the balance which is to be struck when you're dealing with national security, and you're balancing that out, the safety of the community, with some of those matters. And we take national security very, very seriously. We've had, what is it now? I think a dozen serious attempts of mass killings in Australia, which have been averted because of the strength of our national security settings and our national security agencies. I think we can have robust debates around that balance which you're describing, but I think we've actually got the balance pretty right. I mean, general in relation to, a couple of other points which...
I think Australian citizens would be terrified if they actually realised how many of their rights have been eroded in the name of our freedom.
I think our Skype question is trying to get back to make a point. Let's just see if she's there. Go ahead. Yeah.
I did want to respond to Alan Tudge and say I have travelled widely. I have family, Eastern European Jews who come to Australia, and I have visited other authoritarian states. I suppose my point wasn't that we are an authoritarian state now, but I am concerned a bit about the apathy and that maybe we are just creeping slowly towards that.
Okay, Alan, would a Bill of Rights help?
I personally don't support a Bill of Rights, and because it basically means it puts power into the hands of the courts and away from the Parliament. And we've seen that. We've seen that in the United States. Speaking of a great democracy which has a Bill of Rights, I think we've actually done very well in Australia. Our system is inherited from the United Kingdom, of course, and we've generally been a country which has very robust rights, very strong freedoms. And I think that's underpinned us well in terms of today and into the future. Of course, we'll continue to debate these things, as we should. But I just think we should all be keeping perspective about how great this country is, the freedoms and the prosperity that we do have. And acknowledge that if you're talking about authoritarian regimes, there are serious authoritarian regimes in the world at the moment, and you don't see millions of people clamouring to get into those countries.
No, but you can't equate questioning and having concerns about incursions into civil rights with somehow not being a proud and patriotic Australian.
No, I
wasn't
questioning that, Terri. I was just sort of saying let's keep some perspective.
But
I actually said we can legitimately debate some of those matters.
Yes.
We could spend a good session debating, for example, in relation to the media laws and the AFP's decision, which they made lawfully and at arm's length from governments to go and acquire some certain documents. We could have that discussion on that. We could have a discussion about freedom of information laws and how liberal.
But surely the question should be, how can we restore confidence in institutions? And that's really the heart of this.
Let me just ask our other panellist, Shee. You spent a lot of time living in Singapore, which is a much more authoritarian democracy than Australia. Do you think that would be a good way to go?
Singapore is what I call a guided democracy. All right, a lot of people think it's very authoritarian, actually it's not. When I first went there, I thought it was really bad. And I lived and worked there after a few years. I realized, hey, it actually works. Sure, there's a very strong party system, which was almost one-party government for a long, long time, and still is, holds a majority. But
it sort of works if you don't make a fuss.
Well, that is true. But you see, the thing is, when you want to understand a country, like you want to understand Australia the way it is now, you want to understand, say, Singapore the way it is now, or China the way it is, you need to look at the history and the culture and the mindset that's in there. The Chinese, they think of the community and the greater good over the individual rights. And that's one big difference between the West and Asians. And that's where we get it wrong so many times. When we try to foist democracy on Asian cultures, African cultures and all that, it doesn't work. It just bombs out. And the worst thing about it is that Western nations tend to want to import or sort of to export and impose those values on countries going in, forcibly, and under the pretext, and the pretexts, as I said before, have a hidden agenda that only comes out later on when you find out from WikiLeaks and some senators tell you, hey, they actually went in on a pack of lies on this all across the place, and there are whistleblowers that will tell you, hey, it's actually the wrong thing to do.
Okay, Shee, I'm going to throw that to Anthony. And do you take the point that democracy only works in some countries? That's what he's saying, that in China it wouldn't work, the kind of democracy that we have in Australia or even that they have in the United States?
No, I don't accept that. I mean, I think human beings are human beings, and given an opportunity, what they would like is the liberties, the opportunities and so on that we enjoy in the liberal democracies of the world. So I don't think I agree with that. But I do think that out of the conversation so far, a very important point has come up, which is, firstly, security does matter. There's no question about it. It's a major responsibility of government to protect the security of the populace. But it is also true, however, that in the face of terrorist threats and actions, we have nibbled away in a quite troubling fashion at our civil liberties. Not just, I don't know quite what the situation is in Australia, but it certainly happened in the UK and elsewhere. And, one has to remember this. If we're going to be free, if we're going to enjoy our liberties, we have to be prepared to take the risk that's involved. I mean, the way to make everybody safe is to lock us all indoors in our houses, and then all we do is quarrel with our spouses and so on. But if you're going to travel, you're going to get in an aeroplane or a bus or a metro train, you're taking a bit of a risk, but it's a risk which is worthwhile. We always have to remember what Benjamin Franklin said. He said, if you trade your liberties for security, you don't deserve either.
Clare.
I'm just reminded, I've had an American student from Smith College in the United States here interning with me for a couple of months. And we did a trip to Sydney, and she was just flabbergasted that she didn't have to show her passport at the airport, that she could take bottles of water on the plane, and just the level of freedom.
You're talking
that
about
she
travelling
experienced.
domestically.
I'm talking about
Yeah,
travelling
okay.
domestically. But she felt everywhere she went, she was here for 2 months, it was a good visit, that she couldn't believe you didn't have to queue, you didn't have to go through, because she's just gotten so used to the level of security that there is in America. And what she said is that in the 2 months she spent here, she has never felt safer. So I think sometimes we have to look at how the sense of security actually erodes our sense of safety. That these things can be used against us so that as citizens we actually feel less safe in our homes, and that there's a big boogeyman out there. And she said she just actually felt freer in Australia without that security detail that's going on all of the time. And I just think that it's interesting, because it just shows how those large arguments, and particularly authoritarian ones like the war on drugs and the war on terror and the war on crime, they aren't necessarily the things that, what we know is they don't work. I mean, evidence-based shows that they don't work.
Alan, I'll give you the final word.
In relation to what? I mean, democracy we should be defending. We have a great democracy here. We always have to continue to, I think, to work on it. The
question really was about whether the security state actually ends up confining our freedoms or restricting them.
Well, inevitably it does confine them to some extent, and we see that even when you're going to the football or wherever these days when you have to go through security checks. I mean, that's the most obvious manifestation of it. But I think the Australian public expect governments of the day to take the national security exceptionally seriously, particularly when there are very serious threats against us on a very regular basis. And I think we've got pretty good settings in place, but we constantly have to review them and constantly have to be listening to our security agencies who are world class.
Okay, that's all we have time for tonight. I'm sorry to say we haven't solved all the problems of democracy. We'll leave that to you, the citizens of Australia. Please thank our panel, Shee, Terri Butler, AC Grayling, Clare Wright and Alan Tudge.
I muffed up the first question, so I couldn't.
Thank you very much. Now, next week on Q&A, a special look at the case for recognition of Indigenous Australians in our Constitution and an Indigenous voice. Joining the panel, the father of reconciliation, Senator Patrick Dodson. One of the architects of the Indigenous voice to Parliament and the Uluru Statement from the Heart, Noel Pearson. A leading Indigenous opponent of constitutional recognition, Jacinta Price. And the co-chair of the Joint Committee on Closing the Gap, Pat Turner. Till next week, good night.